Today, we're diving into the mind of a man who didn't just predict the future, he calculated it, with the goal of preserving human knowledge after the collapse of a galactic empire. In the pantheon of science fiction icons, few figures loom as large or as intellectually intimidating as the protagonist of Isaac Asimov's legendary Foundation saga. We're talking about the master mathematician, the father of psychohistory, the ultimate architect, Harry Seldon. Here we go. And here we are again for another episode of Greatest Characters in Pop Culture History. I am Nick, and today we're talking about Harry Seldon, one of the greatest science fiction characters of all time from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And with me today is Paul Levinson. He's a PhD in media ecology from NYU, a media theorist, a writer, and a professor known for his work in communications and science fiction. He's also a frequent media commenter on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, NPR, where he discusses politics, pop culture, and the impact of technology. And before his academic career, Paul was a songwriter and a performer. And one of the things I like most about him, he's also a fan of the Beatles and a fan of the New York Yankees baseball team. So welcome to the podcast, Paul Levinson.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. But by the way, I'm still a songwriter, even though I started
That's great.
doing that before I did other things. I may not be, though, as accomplished as a songwriter as I am in other things. I don't know if that's a modest statement or an arrogant statement.
Once you're a performer, always a performer. I said that to one of my colleagues. I work full-time at the New York Botanical Garden doing public relations. And he says he was once an actor. And I said, once you're an actor, you're always an actor. I'm still doing theater in my spare time, but I'm just amazed at how you have time to do everything that you do. Those of you who are not familiar with his work, Paul has written nonfiction books like The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, New Media. He's also written science fiction like The Consciousness Plague, The Plot to Save Socrates, and the Locus Award winner, The Silk Code. So I think you're the perfect person to talk about Isaac Asimov's greatest creation, in my opinion, Harry Seldon.
Well, I agree that it's Isaac Asimov's greatest work. I don't know if I'm the perfect person. David Brin is still around, and for that matter, Gregory Benford. And as you know, they actually had the honor of writing a sequel trilogy in which Harry Seldon plays a slightly different role, of course, than he did in Asimov's original work. But I started reading science fiction right around the time as I started listening to rock and roll. So those two things have always been intertwined in my life, my mind, my soul. And I'll tell you here a story that I've told many other people, and it's a true story. I was in junior high school. I was in seventh grade, junior high school 135 in the Bronx. I had a great class. I had a fine group of teachers, but the librarian, Mrs. Dason, left a little something to be desired. I'll tell you why. One day I walk into my homeroom class in the morning, and my teacher there says, "Paul, could you come up here?" And I come up, and she gives me a note and says, I got this note from the school librarian. She would like you to go down and see her. She wants to talk to you during your free period." So I went down to talk to her. She has an even grimmer expression on her face than my homeroom teacher. And so she says to me, "Do you know why I asked you to come down here and talk to me?" And I actually had no idea. So I said, "No." And she said, "Well, maybe this will give you a hint." And she gave me a sheet of paper on which were written the names of all the books I had taken out of the junior high school library. They were all science fiction. And so then Mrs. Dason came up with this wonderful metaphor. She said, "Look, I'll tell you what I'm concerned about. If all you do is eat one thing, you're going to get physically ill. If all you do is read one thing, I hate to say it, but you may get mentally ill." The wise ass that I was, I controlled myself from saying, "Well, I've been mentally ill since the day I was born." Anyway, she furthermore said, "Look, this is for your own good. I am not going to let you take any more books out of the junior high school library
Wow,
until you start branching out." And I said, "Okay, fine." I never went back to that library. I discovered the New York Public Library. It was 10 blocks from my house, and I read every Isaac Asimov book that was in that
that's
section.
great. That's great. And he was such a prolific writer. I mean, he did stuff besides science fiction. I remember he had a lot of nonfiction books that he wrote, but I fell in love with his work in the 1980s. I joined the science fiction book club where you just buy books over the mail. And that's when I discovered his robot series. And that was my favorite. Like, I think there was a compilation of his short stories, and a lot of these robot stories were these short stories that he had written, and then he compiled them. And seeing how the law of robotics, just how he developed it from story to story. And then I saw that's around the time I think when he came out with his prequels, A Prelude to Foundation. So I was, I just fell in love with it. And then got the originals in paperback and read that. And then, like you said, he after his, tragic death, he got a couple of people to write the next three, right? It was Gregory Brentford did Foundation's Fear, Greg Bear did Foundation and Chaos, and then David Brin did Foundation's Triumph. So he's a great introduction to science fiction, I think, for anyone who is just looking to get into it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something, how I put my foot in my mouth as I all too often do. When I read that new trilogy, and all the books were good, but probably of those 3 writers, Greg Bear was the least well-known and even the least successful. I mean, Benford was already a legend, and Brin had Postman. It was made into a movie starring Kevin Costner, so they were huge titans in the field, and Greg Bear was a little less than that, but when I read the trilogy, I thought Bear's novel was really the best. It was the most like Asimov. So me, like an idiot, I post somewhere something like, "I hate to say it, but I just read the trilogy. It was great, but the best in that trilogy is Greg Bear's novel." And Greg Bear reads it and writes, "What do you mean you hate to say it?"
That's great.
Yeah.
That's
So,
wonderful.
yeah. But the key to me about the Foundation trilogy, which, as you know, was originally a series of short stories and then novelettes and novellas, the two key ingredients, both of which were beyond brilliant, was the general. Here we have Harry Seldon has written out, discovered, developed psychohistory, and he has everything predicted to a T, and we see that the first foundation is really in peril. That's one of the two foundations that are created by Harry Seldon, and they're in real peril because even though the empire is beginning to crumble, they manage to have a brilliant general, Belarios, who commands this huge fleet. And basically, they're getting closer and closer to the first Foundation planet, and I guess Terminus. And Asimov, just like clockwork, works out why even in that situation, the First Foundation is going to succeed because psychohistory predicts that the general is going to be called back at the last minute because in the crumbling empire, the emperor is insecure. I mean, that just struck me. I think I was like 11 years old when I read that. I said, "My God, what a mind to figure this out!" And then, of course, in some ways, even more exciting in the next installment you have the first foundation, they're really happy, they're doing well, they're fighting this slightly crazed person, the mule. They really have no idea who he is, what he's up to. There are a series of wars that they're dealing with. And one of the things that I also love about the Foundation series, Asimov sets up that a hologram of Harry, who's long since died, but he knows what the future is going to be, is going to address the first foundation throughout history as it goes into the future, just to make sure they're on the right track and what they're doing. And there's this scene that to this very day, it's the best scene I've ever read in any novel, where the first Foundation goes into the room, the Harry Seldon hologram comes on, and he starts talking about, well, you know, the merchant wars doing this and that. You got to be careful. Don't worry. Yada ba ba. And as that's happening, the mules' ships appear over the planet and attack the first Foundation. And what Asimov is brilliantly telling us is even psychohistory has its flaws. It is not
Absolutely.
infallible. And so
Yeah.
to me, that was just such brilliant writing. And I have not read anything as thrilling and exciting as that, just the 1950s.
Yeah, and it's something that he was writing from the 50s all the way up to the 80s and then early 90s, and he was able to merge his other stories, the robot stories that I mentioned earlier, the Galactic Empire stories, and make a shared universe before we had Marvel's shared universe and all these other shared universe. I guess you had the Universal Horror Monsters shared universe before that. But yeah, Isaac Asimov was inspired by the Roman Empire, right? And specifically the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, this great written piece by Edward Gibbon. And he started thinking, what if we started telling the story on a galactic scale? So Asimov wasn't the first to write about galactic empires, but I think he really nailed it. And when we think of galactic empires and all the other stories that have come after, like Dune and Star Wars, they owe a debt to what Isaac Asimov has done. So he came up with this character, Harry Seldon, who's a brilliant mind and starts coming up with this thing called psychohistory where he can predict the future and he suddenly sees the collapse of the empire. And with that, again, looking at what happened to the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages will come. And he's like, what can we do to preserve all this knowledge so it doesn't get lost and shorten those Dark Ages? And that becomes the foundation. But like you said, he starts also predicting what can happen to threaten the Foundation. So all these Seldon crises emerge, and he's predicted it, and he creates these holograms. So here's a character who's not there in person through the whole plot. He appears in various times like a hologram, just announcing the next thing. But the thing about psychohistory is you can predict what society does on a mass scale, but it's those individuals that are hard to predict. So when something like the mule comes, this like telepathic villain, it's hard to predict. So, I mean, what a great concept.
Yes, and one of the things that made Asimov such a brilliant writer, and he invests his brilliance into Harry Seldon, is Asimov also had a profound understanding of biology. I mean, he was a
Hmm.
professor of biochemistry at Boston College, so he had this dual life. On the one hand, he was a writer. For a while, he gave up, by the way, writing science fiction in the 60s. He said, I'm just going to write serious books, but he couldn't resist coming back to them. And it was his knowledge of biology that helped him create this character, the mule, which in principle is not predictable. Because if you're talking about a mutation, you might even predict that there will be mutations, but you can't possibly predict. It's rolling the genetic dice, what
Hmm.
characteristics the mutation is going to have. And that in itself is a brilliant piece of work. I have to say here, though, and I've written a lot about this, and I'm sure some of the people who are watching this have seen the Foundation
Hmm.
series on Apple TV. I don't think the series at all measures up to what the written work of Asimov was. There are some good things about the series, not to give too much away, rather than just a normal series of emperors in which it's passed on from father to son, etc., etc. In the television version of the Foundation series, Cleon, who is an important emperor at the beginning of the Asimov written stories, somehow is cloned, and there are actually three versions of him: a young version, a full adult version, and an old man version. And I, by the way, feel like I'm all three most of the time. But 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 I mean, that is interesting. That's excellent science fiction. And so I give David Goyer, who was the main creative force behind that, a lot of credit for developing that. But they completely messed up the Harry Seldon story. He doesn't appear in a hologram for a while. He lives, he's brought back to life, then he is a hologram. The whole thing, if you haven't read the Foundation trilogy and the Foundation series, you might enjoy it, and I don't begrudge anyone who enjoys anything, but my strong recommendation would be read the trilogy
Definitely.
first. Yeah.
Yeah, read it. And every time I read it when I was a kid, I kept thinking to myself, I wish they adapted it, but I was like, how could they adapt it? It was so hard because it spans centuries, you know? But that's the thread that goes through it, Harry Seldon, because he appears every time there's a crisis. He's there to talk about it. We predicted it. Here's what we do. And then even when the first foundation is threatened, you learn that there's a secret second foundation because he predicted it that there would be a threat. So it's brilliant. And I did watch the Apple series, and as I was watching it, it had been a while since I'd read it. There were changes to it that I said I don't remember that from the books. But like you said, the recommendation, read the books first. It's a beautiful looking series, you know. And I want to go back. They also did a radio drama, which I had not listened to, but that was in 1973, Foundation trilogy. And William Edel was the voice of Harry Seldon in that. I love radio dramas. I know when they did Star Wars, I love that. So that's something to look up if people are interested. I'm sure a little more faithful to what Isaac Asimov had done.
Oh, well, absolutely, and just speaking egotistically, one of my favorite things in all the work that I've done is there is a wonderful radio dramatic, play of the chronology protection case. It was actually scripted and acted by Mark Shanahan, who actually was a student of mine at Fordham, and, a great student, and he was even, teaching adjunct at Fordham for about 10 or
Nice.
15 years. I don't know if you ever ran into him. He's now a very successful playwright, and he puts these theatrical productions together, and his, audio book of the chronology protection case is fabulous,
That's
unlike
great.
David Goyer's Foundation series on television. And then the other thing that makes me very happy is my most recent novel. It's Real Life and Alternate History of the Beatles. The first chapter of that was made into a radio play by another one of my former students, a guy by the name of Vin Tisi, who now goes by the name of Vin Cyclone. I don't know why he changed his name, but he is a very gifted radio producer, and in that I actually played the main role of Pete
Oh,
Forner,
that's great.
who, as you know, was a disc jockey at Fordham University. So I think radio plays are wonderful.
They're fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those people back in 30s and 40s, we think, oh my God, those poor people, they didn't have television,
They had radio.
that's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's where even Isaac Asimov probably was inspired by some of these radio adventures and a lot of the pulp fiction of the time, the science fiction. It just the imagination just went wild. It was limitless what you could do. The great thing though is even though there is action in the Foundation series, it's so much cerebral thought. And a lot of these crises weren't solved by just a war where you would just decimate the opponent. It was done through economic theory and manipulation, and that kind of stuff just made you just amazed at the possibilities of what can happen. And I think that's why this story has resonated for as long as it did.
Yeah, and I think the brilliance of Harry Seldon as a character, to get back to what we were talking about before and why he's my favorite character in pop fiction and in popular culture for that matter, is he was so intelligent that he put aside his own ego and realized that there were limitations in psychohistory. That's why
Mhm.
he created the second foundation, because
Yeah.
he foresaw that Harry Seldon couldn't predict everything, so he created an organization that would keep track of what was going on, would develop their own mental powers, and they would be able to deal with the mule. And that is a brilliant thing. That kind of humbleness of a character who has so much mental power is really an amazing combination.
Yeah. And I give a little credit to John Campbell, the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, who kind of pushed Asimov in the direction to come up with Foundation and then the second Foundation. Because originally Asimov kind of just wanted to retell the collapse of the Roman Empire on a galactic scale, and it was Campbell who kind of said, "Well, let's talk more about what comes after. Like, how do you preserve that?" And that's where the foundation and the secret second foundation, and the fact that it's in the background, and then Asimov comes up with like merging a lot of these other characters from his other sagas. He had R. Daniel, the robot from his who's kind of behind the scenes these thousands of years manipulating everything, pulling the strings. So I guess that raises the question then, like what I've always thought, like this whole notion of having this kind of secret foundation that's kind of preserve. Yes, it's helping humanity survive and knowledge survive, but the whole notion that we're being driven by these secret forces that kind of, as a civilization, what is our destiny? And would it have happened if the foundation hadn't existed? Would it have been the collapse of the empire, or would they found another way? So it's just like that notion of, was it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because you see the story where the foundation really becomes a mover of what's happening.
Yeah, and, just to get back to John Campbell, Asimov himself in his autobiographies, he has, like, I think, like, 2 huge volumes. I have both of them. I highly recommend them because Asimov just lays it all out. He tells you every little thing. He tells you what he had for dinner and how that influenced what he wrote, So, I mean, uh, and I got to know Asimov a little bit.
That's so great.
Yeah, the first book I had published was a collection of essays about the philosopher Karl Popper. At first, I was thinking, who would be the best person to write preface to it? And then I realized maybe I'll get 2 people to write the preface. So I got Isaac Asimov to write one of
That's
them,
so great.
and yeah, and in that preface, he talks about it and spells out very, very briefly his love of what he wrote. But to get back to the role of Campbell, in Asimov's autobiographies, he says point blank, "I had no idea what I was going to do after each, foundation story until I went in and I talked to John Campbell." So, I mean, that's an
That's
astonishing
great.
thing. And, the connection between Asimov writing the preface for In Pursuit of Truth was the name of the fellowship that I put together for Karl Popper. The connection between that and what he writes in his autobiography is, as a philosopher and a scientist, he was a great believer in truth,
Mm,
something which is in short supply in our own world,
uh,
people who believe in the truth. It meant something to him. He was the complete antithesis of a relativist, somebody who says, well, what you think is correct, but you think the opposite, that's correct too.
mm,
No, that's not the way the world is. There are things that are happening, there are things that are real, and there are things that are not. And he had this in mind, Asimov did, as a science fiction writer, as someone who was even telling his own life story. That's why it wasn't Campbell who went around trumpeting when he was still alive, "Hey, I came up with all those ideas." He didn't come up with all those ideas, but it was not me, Campbell said, who pushed Asimov. It was Asimov who basically told the world that that happened.
yeah, yeah. And that just reminds me of another great speculative fiction writer, Harlan Ellison, who's always like, "We're not all entitled to our opinions. We're only entitled to our informed opinions," right? Nobody's entitled to be ignorant. So that whole notion of truth coming forth and again preserving all the knowledge of humanity that has spanned millions of planets in his fiction and his creation. And imagine if we have like the Library of Alexandria and all these lost knowledge that's out there, all the things that's inspired. Like, he had the Galactic Encyclopedia, and some people say Wikipedia is similar to that now. And all, this whole notion of psychohistory has spawned a lot of this statistical analysis, and even what we're coming up with artificial intelligence now, and this predictive nature, and some of the safeguards and guardrails that are being created. A lot of it, Asimov was prescient to a lot of this stuff.
Well, absolutely, but, it was not completely prescient, it was beginning to happen in his time. If
Mm,
you think about predictive statistics, that is, you go out and you do a survey of people, and I mean, this goes back literally to the end of the 1800s, and you make sure that the survey is not biased, meaning, let's say, if you wanna know what the average height of a population is, you don't go to the men's basketball locker and basically measure everyone's height there because they're going to be taller, so the
Right.
survey is going to be biased. But that notion, which goes back to the statisticians, literally, in the 1880s, 1890s, and was slowly percolating its way through both science and
Right.
culture. I think that's what Asimov jumped on, either consciously or not, when he developed psychohistory. Because, in a way, to the extent that Asimov describes psychohistory, it's like a series of mathematical equations. How different is that from statistics, that you
Mm.
get and you put them together and you predict who's going to vote for whom? And by the way, interestingly, and not a coincidence because it shows again the fallibility of psychohistory, but as we know, surveys are fallible also. In fact, this goes back to the 1930s. You probably know about this. There was a survey done right before the 1936 election. FDR is running for a second term, and a magazine called Literary Digest decides to do a survey because they want to predict who's going to win the election. And the survey comes in, and FDR is crushed in the survey because it shows the Republican candidate is gonna slaughter him. Now, that survey made a mistake, and it didn't realize it because it was conducted by calling people on the telephone, which in 1936, only very rich people had telephones. So the very
Yes.
rich people didn't like Roosevelt. That's why he lost in that survey, but he wins by a landslide in the actual election. Surveys continue to be both useful and fallible in the same way that psychohistory is.
Yeah. Yeah. What other characters? I know you mentioned the general and you mentioned the mule. Are there other characters in the Foundation story that interact with Harry Seldon that you think are worth talking about?
Well, Evening Miss, without giving too much away in case there's some soul out there who hasn't read the novels, and I think Evening Miss is also a character, again, not exactly the same character in the television series, but I would say he also is one of my favorite characters because he lives at a time in which it's known where the second foundation is. Now, the mule is searching desperately to find the second foundation because the mule, very intelligent guy, he might be a psychopath, but he's certainly intelligent. He knows that the second foundation poses a threat to him. So he wants to find the second foundation and destroy it before that happens. Evening Miss is from the first foundation, and he wants to find the second foundation just to be in touch with them. And there's a whole part of a book in which he is searching for the second foundation. And again, I won't say how
Yeah.
that ends. We both know how that ends, but I thought that was a very dramatic thing. And then, of course, Beta Daryl and Arcady Daryl. Asimov was wrongly criticized throughout most of his career as a writer about not having enough or even any women heroes in his book. But the Darrells, Beta and Arcady,
Yeah.
are heroes, and they're also
Mhm.
2 excellent, characters.
Yeah. And I would say one of my favorite characters in all of his books is probably Susan Calvin from his Robot series. So I think he does a great job with that. Certainly a bias back in the day. That was a criticism for a lot of the science fiction. But I wouldn't criticize Asimov for that. Like you said, I think he does have a couple of strong ones there. A good point about spoilers. I think people should definitely read the books because even the mule, we've talked about the mule, but just the way he reveals who the mule is one of the greatest twists, I
Yeah.
think, in any fiction, not just science fiction. I think that's really wonderful. We talked about Dune and Star Wars. Do you agree that like the empires that are depicted there owe a debt to Asimov?
Absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. And, and in terms of his tying everything together, he was actually in the 1950s, after he'd written all the Foundation series, he began talking much more about the empire and about earlier
Mhm.
times and so on. And his robot novels were written in the 50s, at least 2 of them. Then he finally wrote a third, I
Mhm.
guess, in the 1980s, and then merged the 2 things together. But yeah, Asimov actually, in addition to all that, by the way, wrote a couple of pretty good, just straight up mystery stories as well. You mentioned that you first began reading Asimov, reading his robot stories.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, the laws of robotics are brilliant also. And and here again, it's important to bear in mind, Asimov was both a science fiction writer and a mystery writer because one of the mysteries that he deals with in one of his robot novels is it looks like a robot kills somebody, a
Uh-huh.
human being, but that violates the first and most primary law of robotics. So how could that have happened? And the whole story is based on explaining how that happened. As Asimov was writing his science fiction, his mystery brain was figuring out how to present it in a very exciting, interesting way. Dune, of course, was written after the Foundation series. So certainly the Foundation series certainly influenced Frank Herbert and the Dune movies, which I think, by the way, are better representations of Dune, once again, than the Apple TV series is of Foundation for whatever it.
Yeah, I like the new Dune movies a lot myself. I think they were really, really great. But yeah, I think the Apple series visually is just so beautiful, really beautifully done. But I just remember seeing explosions in that pilot episode, and I was like, I see what they're trying to make it more action packed than it probably needs to be. But I have to say, the actor who plays him, Jared,
Yeah.
he's great. I like him as an actor.
Well, I agree completely. So I first got to know him in Mad Men. He was fabulous in that.
Hmm.
He also played the lead scientist in Chernobyl. That was a series
Hmm.
a few years ago.
Yeah,
He's an incredibly gifted actor, and none of what I'm saying about the television series is in any way his fault because he's
exactly.
excellent in every single scene.
Yeah, when he gives gravitas, I think, to the as soon as he appears on screen as Harry, your eyes are captivated to him, and you say, "This is an important character." But in the books, like I said, he's that thread. He even when he's not there, his presence, when people talk about him, when they talk about the Seldon plan and the Seldon crises, he's overshadowing everything. Obviously, he has an ethical point of view, and he's doing the right thing from his point of view. How do you think? And I'm sure this is all stuff Asimov was thinking about, and I wish he had lived to do even more exploration of the seas that he sowed. But what do you think of that? Like about just society being guided without its knowledge, and the conflict too between foundations, and how the second foundation is in secret, and even people in the first foundation didn't know that the second foundation existed.
I have no problem with that if it's done for the greater good. And you made a very, very important point about, how most science fiction stories, any kind of story, a mystery story, there's a lot of action in there.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to keep in mind, although there's some action in the Foundation series, and again, this gets back more to the original series, most things are settled not by physical force, but by
Mhm.
mental agility. So I'm
Absolutely.
thinking about the ultimate confrontation between the mayor or whatever his name is of the second foundation, the first speaker, I think that's his name, and the mule, and how that conflict is settled. So, for Asimov, it's a chess game. And I remember when I first read that as a kid, I was very impressed with that because I was thinking, wouldn't it be a good way if instead of going to war and bombing people and killing people, the two groups that would be at war sat down at a table and worked things out?
What a concept.
I think, I give Asimov credit for exploring that concept.
Right. He also doesn't seek personal glory, Selden. He doesn't want statues built of him, even though it seems like he becomes this hero because he saved civilization. But I think that's a noble goal for a hero. He doesn't want to rule the galaxy. He wants to save it. He wants to save humanity. And he also sees that you can't avoid the collapse of the empire, and the empire needs to collapse, preserving the history and all the information and the knowledge. I think that's just a noble thing.
It
So what do you
is.
think about that?
Yeah, well, I just wanna say as far as statues, this is another thing. I hate to, like, be on a, a tirade against the television series, but there's a statue. We have more than one statue of Harry Seldon. It
Yeah,
almost looks like Lenin, not John Lennon. Lenin,
right.
Linin, the kind of things you saw
Mhm.
in the Soviet Union, these, like, statues, standing in front of some, like, public, edifice or
Exactly.
something. But
And that's totally against what he would have wanted, right?
that's
The
right.
character does not want that. The character is not about self-aggrandizement. It's about saving the people and saving knowledge.
Yes. And, I often tell people ask me, "Can you give me any advice, any hints about what to do, what decisions to make if you wanna write a piece of fiction?" And the first thing I always tell everyone is, and I'm not the only one who says this, write about what you know best. And what or who do you know best? Yourself, because you
Mhm.
know how you think. And the other story I often, tell people is I left the manuscript of The Silk Code on the kitchen table before the book was published, and my then 12-year-old daughter, Molly, she wakes up, like, on a Saturday morning, goes down and, like, sits down and is, like, reading the whole thing, and she said 2 things. So she said, "Daddy, I love this." So I tried to get Tor Books to put that on the back cover, but they said no.
That would have been the best
Exactly.
blurb ever.
Yeah, exactly, but then she said, "Daddy, Phil D'Amato," who's the lead character in The Silk Code, "Phil D'Amato's just like you." And
Oh,
I
wow.
that actually made me feel good because I knew that, because if you're writing about a character and you're really invested in the character, in order to make the character as real as possible, the best thing that you can do is think about what you would do in
Mm,
that situation, and maybe the character won't do exactly the same thing or think the same thing because there are other factors in the novel, but by and large, that's the truest course of action. So I think Asimov was thinking of himself when he created the character of Harry Seldon, which is another
yeah.
really nice thing. I'll tell you another story about Asimov, my relationship with him. So I got him to write one of the prefaces of In Pursuit of Truth, but before I got him to write it, I went to see the editor, a guy by the name of Simon Silverman, who sadly is no longer with us, but he had a small press, Unity's Press, in New Jersey. And I said to him, "Guess what? I got Isaac Asimov to write the preface." He said, "That's wonderful." I said, "So we have to give him some money?" I'm thinking, like, what, like $5,000? Oh, 10,000? What are we gonna give him? And he looks at me and says, "We'll give him $100." I'm like, "Are you kidding?" And I'm thinking, "I'll put more money in myself." And he says, "Trust me, trust me." Isaac Asimov has a firm principle. He wants to get paid. And, so you're right about that. But as long as he gets paid something, he'll be happy to do it.
That's
So
great.
that night I called, Isaac Asimov on the phone. "How you doing?" We already knew each other. I'd already, by the way, written an article comparing the Foundation series to the Dune series, the written series, and it was published in a small journal called Media Methods. And a guy by the name of Frank McLaughlin, another guy who unfortunately is no longer with us, was the editor. So I already knew Asimov. We talked on the phone, and I invited him to write the preface, and then I could barely bring myself to say it. I said, the publisher will pay you $100. I was waiting for him to hang up the phone. He says to me, "Great." So,
That's great.
yeah. So
Yeah.
but again, the more important point, I do think that both in terms of our Daniel Oliver, who's the name of the robot, that's a
Mhm.
very important character who becomes almost more human than human beings, and Harry Seldon, these major characters, you can tell with the intensity that Asimov wrote them that he was putting his own thoughts into
Yeah.
those, his own personality, his own instincts into those characters.
Yeah, I was gonna say that after you mentioned that I do feel like I see some of Asimov in Seldon, definitely. And I think you can't avoid that, I guess, when you spend so much time thinking about these characters and bringing them to life, and, the characters you write yourself. I think they by necessity have to have a bit of the author in them.
Absolutely, and so I had a lot of fun with my Sierra Waters time travel trilogy because Sierra Waters is a woman, and apropos of what we were talking about earlier, I was determined that people wouldn't say about my work what they said about Asimov's work. I wanted to have a couple of women heroes in my stories. So the hero of the Sierra Waters trilogy is Sierra Waters, but it's much more difficult to write a woman if
It
you're a man
Yes,
than it is to write a man.
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I had to
Yeah,
try to think, what would my wife say in that situation?
yeah.
Those kinds of things. And again, stories ring true to the extent that you write about things you know, because that is a reality. The same, by the way, applies to locations. So, like, if any writers are listening to this, do yourself a favor and try not to write about a place that you've never been to. And
Mm.
people ask me, "Well, why are so many of your stories and novels situated in New York City?" There's your answer. Uh,
There's your answer.
Yeah. I have to
Yeah.
tell you, by the way, I have a new story coming out next month in April. It's the 100th anniversary of Amazing Stories, and
Yes.
it's I'm really thrilled about it because my first story published in a big pro magazine was a story called Albert's Cradle about Cat's Cradle and how Albert Einstein got some of his ideas from that. And that was published way back in 1994. Kim Mohan was the editor then Ira Naiman in the late 20 teens published a couple of my stories, but now a combination of the new publisher Steve Davidson and Lloyd, I forget his last name, will kill me, but you can just look it up, Lloyd something. Lloyd Penny, that's it. Okay, a penny for your thoughts, Lloyd Penny. They invited me to write this new, and also Kermit Woodall, part of the editorial staff. They invited me to write a story. So, in terms of writing about something, I'm not going to tell you too much about it. It's a time travel story about the Yankees. Okay.
I'm gonna love it right there.
Yeah.
You got me hooked. So
Well, that should be out in a couple of weeks. But
that is
again,
great.
yeah, I'm not gonna write if I wanna write a story about a baseball team, I'm not gonna
Mm.
write a story about the Baltimore Orioles because first of
It's
all, I
gotta be
can't
about
stand them and I don't know them. So
That's great. I can't wait to read that. That's fantastic. What a life you've lived. You know, you've known Isaac Asimov, you've known Marshall McLuhan, you've known all these wonderful people, and now I have the pleasure of knowing you and you bring through your stories, through your nonfiction, just wonderful thoughts and ideas. I hope anyone who's listening to this who has not read some of your stuff finds it and reads it. And definitely anyone who has never read Isaac Asimov should hunt them down right away. Start with whatever you like, whether it's the Foundation series, the robot stories. I'm telling you, that compilation of his short stories, I think it was in 2 volumes. I went through that so fast and I reread it over and over. His short stories were wonderful. And some of the greatest stories ever written, Nightfall, right? About this planet that only sees nighttime once in like centuries or something. And what happens, from that. Just the speculation that inspired him to come up with all these stories and ideas. But like you said, it has to come from what you know. Even these fictional, science fictional fantasies originate from ideas and speculations that he had. Asimov was reading about the Roman Empire, and that made his imagination start going down all these paths.
always understood Asimov because as a kid, when I read about the Roman Empire, and actually I still feel bad about it, I was very unhappy that it fell. I would have liked the Roman Empire to continue. I was always glad that the Eastern Roman Empire lasted another 1,000 years. Came the Byzantine Empire, but then the Turks knocked that one out. So I was not happy about that. So I understand completely where Asimov was coming from. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, the Roman Empire basically controlled all of Europe, a little bit even of Asia and so on. We, in many ways, are products of the Roman Empire. Christianity wouldn't have emerged had it not been for the Roman Empire. So there also, Asimov was into something that I think a lot of people also were into. How could he make the Roman Empire continue? Of course, some science fiction writers like Robert Silverberg, who've even written alternate histories in which the
Yeah.
Roman Empire continues longer. But that comes from the same motive as Asimov had. And by the way, Robert Silverberg is another great writer. I started reading him as a kid, and he's still alive and kicking and doing a great job.
Yeah. And as of this recording today, we are right on the preface of Artemis 2 being launched, which is going to send human beings around the moon and back again. So we as a species are still looking to the stars, still looking to who knows where we'll be, whether we'll reach Mars someday and human beings will step foot on Mars, whether we'll go beyond. But this notion of an empire, of galactic empire, and just going out there and just seeding the stars and having human beings go forth and spreading knowledge. That's something that as Isaac Asimov, John Campbell, all these great pioneers of science fiction, their imaginations. This was before we even stepped foot on the moon when they were writing these stories.
Yeah, that's right, and, that's another one of the great disappointments in my life. I mean, it's hard for some people to understand, but, like, in 1969, when we, got to the moon, we human beings, somebody had asked me, I would say, "Well, we'll probably have a colony there. By the 1980s, we'll no doubt get to Mars, even beyond this, who knows, maybe we'll cryogenically freeze people and send a ship out to some other stars." And I would have bet a huge amount of money that in the year 2026 we wouldn't be where we are now. And so I'm delighted about the return to the moon. By the way, I interviewed obviously the first American, I guess the second human being to circle the Earth, John Glenn, for a
Mm,
book I co edited, basically touching the face of the cosmos on the intersection of space travel and religion. And I know Rusty Schweikert, who is an astronaut. And I want to just give a plug for Deanna Wiebel, who has written a book about the experience of being an astronaut, what it feels
that's
like.
so great.
Yeah, so I mean, there still is an enormous amount of interest in space, and maybe,
Yeah.
maybe, maybe we're finally going to begin to go back
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah, that's why I love to give Apple TV some credit for good science fiction. They do this wonderful For All Mankind
Yeah,
TV series, the alternate universe,
I agree.
where we were beaten by the Russians landing on the moon, but then the space race continues and we actually reach Mars. It's a great series. So anyone who hasn't seen that should check that out as
I
well.
love it, and actually, it's a brilliant setup because the reason why the space, development continued and we got so far on Mars was precisely because the Soviets beat us, so both of our space programs are alive and vibrant.
Right.
After we beat the Soviets, we figured, "Okay, we're there already, we don't have to do anything anymore,"
Exactly.
and the Soviet
Exactly.
Union was not interested in it either.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I've been talking to Paul Levinson, and we've been talking about Harry Seldon from the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. Any of you who have not checked it out, please do. And I hope to have you on again, Paul, because this has been fun. And there's so many other characters to talk about from so many other works of fiction over the years. If you haven't checked out any of Paul's novels and stories, look them up. There's some great things. And I will see you all next time on Greatest Characters in Pop Culture History.
Thank you.